Thank you, everybody. So the title of my presentation is First, Shoot All the Officers. I want to emphasize that's not my sentiment. We'll find out more as we move along. So in October 1914, the first Canadian contingent arrived in England. It was met by Captain J.F.C. Fuller, the future military theoretician, who said, it's a fine body of men and would do well if given adequate training, but first, shoot all the officers. But this presents a puzzle, because by 1918, the Canadian Expeditionary Force has to be regarded amongst the elite formations on the Western Front. But it was primarily and predominantly commanded by officers from the first contingent. 80% of the colonels and generals who led combat units in the CEF in 1918 were from the first contingent. Even 40% of the battalion commanders came from the first contingent. Now, there's been a lot of factors that have been explained as to why did the Canadians improve so much. Was it, the impact that the Canadian Corps was a semi-permanent, semi-independent formation, the contribution of superb British staff officers, the quality of the Canadian personnel, the quantity of the personnel. But none of this would have availed much were it not for the officers that commanded, that administered, that provided the logistics, the training, the planning, and the leadership that made the Canadians as good as they are. And so the purpose of this presentation is to give you some more insight into these officers that Fuller wanted to have shot. So I'm going to look at 169 officers. This is from a larger survey that I'm doing of 436 officers that commanded battalion, brigades, divisions, and the combat arms in the Expeditionary Force during the war. So I'm going to start by talking about the state of the Canadian military in 1914. I'm going to look at how these officers were selected. Then I'm going to take a look at some of their characteristics. And at which point I'm going to start breaking it down into 4 campaigns. So what was the role of the first contingent in the command ranks during Second Ypres and Festubert in 1915, Somme 1916, Passchendaele 1917, and the Somme in 1918. In between, I'm going to highlight 8 officers that were residing in British Columbia at the start of the war to put a human face on all the numbers I'm going to provide, and also give you some of the range of experiences that they had. And then I'm going to tie it together with a preliminary explanation of how do we go from shoot all the officers to these being such excellent formations. So let's start with the military. So the key to the Canadian military before the war is the militia myth, that free men riding hard, shooting straight can defeat any number of regimented regulars. Now, it was convenient to have a militia because Canada could not afford a large enough regular army to deter the Americans. But what's more, as illustrated by these 2 troopers from the Canadian Mounted Rifles, the Canadian militia did quite well in the Boer War. In fact, better than some British regular army units. So how was this all manifest? It was a 3,100-man permanent force whose job was to train the nominally 74,000-man militia. What are they? They're all ill-trained. In comparison to the British Army, the permanent force is a pale substitute. Militia, you get maybe 2 weeks of training, and that at a very rudimentary level. They're also hampered by 3 Ps of partisanship, of patronage, and as you see here illustrated by Curry in his 50th Gordon Highlanders uniform, performative masculinity. A lot of time is spent as a militia as a social club versus as an institution dedicated to training for war. In the immediate aftermath of the war, a commentator called the Canadian militia a Falstaffian array, and this is a sentiment most historians today would enthusiastically endorse. I think we're going to have to revise that slightly, as I will talk about through the course of the presentation. So, who made the choices? Well, it is the protean figure of Sam Hughes, the bumptious, pugnacious, partisan, pandemonium-creating Minister of Militia. He throws out the mobilization scheme and forms his first contingent in as his ideal. So how did he choose the commanding officers? Well, first of all, Permanent force officers need not apply. There is only one that served with the Canadian Division in a combat role, and he was a second choice. There are permanent officers, but they are serving in the staff or administrative roles. So he's looking at militia officers. So he's looking at relatively young men, men in their 40s that had long, distinguished careers in the militia. Ideally, they're a senior major or maybe a regimental commander. Should have some military training, but it's not necessary. Active duty would be good, but absolutely not necessary. But then there's also a series of social dimensions or factors. Are these prominent people in their community? Are these someone that the others in the community look up to? Certainly is beneficial if they are conservative, but there are Republicans like Curry that are as part of the first contingent. Now, one other interesting dimension is that there is an entire hierarchy in the militia of brigade commanders, division, and district commanders. And none of them get selected for the first contingent. In fact, only a handful of them ever arrive. They get as far as England, and they all are disasters. They are complete failures. And there may be a reason, that may be the reason why Hughes did not select them. I'll talk a bit more about that. Now, Hughes gets a lot of criticism and justified for his administrative appointments, and many, if not most of his combat appointments turn out to be not great choices. But when it comes to the first contingent, he does amazingly well. So the British Army, regular Army officers in command of infantry battalions in 1914 had a failure rate of 4.5%. So 4.5% of them get sacked, get removed, somehow move on. These are officers with 20 to 25 years experience, highly likely have formal training, and have seen active duty. Hughes's number is 5%, which you consider you're choosing amateur officers, over half of whom have had no active duty experience. He does surprisingly well. And we'll get into more of that in a little bit later in the presentation. So what about the military experience of these officers that he chooses? Well, 73% of them come from the militia. And this is a number that will drop to 61% by the end of the war for the entire CEF. Senior combat ranks I'm talking about. So this is overwhelmingly a militia-led force. 14% of the initial choice are permanent force. They drop to 9% by the end of the war. There are 7% of British officers that were either serving currently or had retired. And then there's a grab bag of officers that served in the Swedish Navy, the Belgian Congo Army, the French Army, the American Army, everything under the sun. So less than half of these officers have any formal instruction. And I count attending RMC or Sandhurst maybe 30 years before as formal military training. So most of them have none. Less than half have active duty experience. If they do, it was in 1885 or during the Boer War when they would have been a junior subaltern. They have about 14 years experience, 12 years in the permanent force. So these officers do not have the same level of experience as their British counterparts by a long shot. And they are majors and lieutenant colonels predominantly. Now what about the demographics? So the first contingent was, it's led by Canadians. They are commanding British-born individuals for the most part. So 70% Canadian, 70% British in the other ranks. But further, there's another 13% that have been in Canada for 10 years, which I count as being Canadian by that point. If you've been here for 10 years, you're a Canadian. So again, overwhelmingly commanded by Canadians. Average age is around 40. Hughes is trying to get younger officers. Youngest is McNaughton at 28. Malcolm Mercer at 59 commands the 1st Brigade. 74% of these officers live west of Quebec, and this is going to continue through the entire war. This is a force that is led by people from Ontario and from the west. 2/3 of them are businessmen or professionals, and this is an important point. So these are people that, and I'll talk more about it later, so these are not professional military officers. These are the people that lead your local company, or maybe they're your local dentist. But they have qualifications that might be relevant. They are a middle-class institution. There's only a handful of officers that are lower class and just a much smaller portion upper class. Compare that to the British, where it is upper middle class and middle or upper class individuals. And as a group, they have little cohesion. They have not grown up together. They haven't gone to the same schools. In fact, they probably don't even know each other. If somebody is in Halifax, it's highly unlikely they would have met Arthur Curry, who lives in Victoria. Unlike in the British, and we'll talk about this and we'll do a comparison. So by the way, this is Haig in 1918 with his army generals. So just to refresh where the Canadians are, militia force, less than half have training or active duty, limited cohesion. Let's take a look at the British. Well, 2/3 of the regular army battalion commanders during the war came from the regular army. 98% of the generals came from the regular army. There are only 6 brigadier generals on the Western Front who are not regulars in 1918. 2/3 of the infantry officers or battalion commanders have formal military training. Pretty much all the engineers and the artillery officers have formal training. Pretty much all of them have active duty experience. They've been in the Army for 20 to 25 years, and by basis of class, education, service, and mores, they're a cohesive group. Canadians have only developed that cohesiveness through the course of the war. There's a famous quote of a British staff officer just prior to the Somme, where there's a planning session. There's 160 officers. He says, it was like a race meeting. Everybody knew everybody. That would not be the case in the early stages of the war for the Canadians. So let's start with our first campaign. So Second Ypres and Festubert, this is the famous painting of Second Ypres hanging in the Canadian War Museum. So I'm going to start off by taking a look, not at that whole 169, I'll get back to it, but just taking a look at the battalion and brigade commanders who served at Second Ypres. There's 26 of them. So what happened to them? 4 killed in action. It's the most costly action from a command standpoint that the Canadians would endure. 28% received no further promotions. They may last for another couple months or maybe a year or so before they get shuffled off. But 72% are promoted. 7 become brigadier generals, 7 become major generals, albeit 2 in Canada, and 2 are lieutenant generals. This is a phenomenal success rate. I don't think there are many militaries that you would see something like that. And this is going to be a central point of the discussion in the conclusion. Now let's compare that first contingent. Hughes does a pretty good job, right, in the first batch. What happens with the second contingent, meaning the second division? This is the painting of the battle for the sugar refinery at the 2nd Division's great victory at Courcelette on the 15th of September, 1916. So the 2nd Division follows the original mobilization scheme. Hughes picks the brigadier generals and division commander. Only one actually lasts for more than 6 months. The district staff officers, however, picked all of those other officers. So of the 31 officers that commanded the 2nd Division at the front to the end of the Somme, there are 31 of them. 10 of these, though, are from the first contingent. So already the division is starting to replace some of the dead weight that was sent across the waters. So of this 31, 10 are promoted, but 7 of those are from the first contingent. So not a very good success rate. 7 are sacked. Another 5 are transferred under dubious circumstances where you can't really say for sure they're sacked, but boy, it sure looks suspicious. 3 remain in command. 4 are evacuated for legitimate health reasons, and there's another 2 that leave because their wives died and they left young families behind. So when we add all this up, the success rate of the first contingent is 72%, second contingent is 13%. Now here's a clue as to why Hughes did not select any of the district, division, and brigade staffs and commanders for his first contingent. Now if we take a look at what was the role of the first contingent in Second Ypres, not surprisingly, all the command slots are held by members of the first contingent. But already 2 have died, 1 was killed, 1 drowned, and 14 officers have been shuffled off. And we will build this out through the course of the presentation as you see the role, what and how it changes. So I wanted to put a little bit of a human face in this. So I'm going to take a look at the British Columbia component. So these are 24 officers residing in British Columbia at the start of the war. 11 Okay, 11 of them were born in Canada, with 2 having been in Canada for 10 years. This is an artifact of the massive influx of people from England moving to British Columbia in the years prior to the war. They do pretty well. 8 generals, 16 field officers. That includes Currie as a lieutenant general and 2 major generals. So pretty good performance. What are their fates? Well, 12 were serving in the CEF at the end of the war. 6 were serving in England, Canada, or with the British. And 4 had died. 1 was a prisoner of war, and 1 was a civilian. One of the people that I will be talking about later. So let's go to our first case. So this is Bob Leckie. He's born in Canada, born in Halifax. He's a consulting engineer, mining engineer in Vancouver, and very successful. He goes all over the province. He's also got impeccable military credentials. He's a graduate of RNC. He's fought in the Boer War. He has the militia staff certificate and has served for 20 years. He also commands the 72nd Regiment. He's a perfect fit for what Hughes is looking for. Not surprisingly, he's selected to command the 16th Battalion in the 1st Contingent. He does well with that and is appointed to command the 3rd Brigade in August 1915 when Turner takes over the 2nd Division. He, however, suffers a wound, a very serious, he's shot through both legs in February 1916 and can no longer serve at the front. Instead, he holds a training command in Britain and then eventually moves to take over the military district based in Victoria as a major general. And as with almost all of these appointments, there are machinations behind it. So wait for the next episode. We'll get to that. Now this is Gilbert Goodson, and he kind of illustrates the cost of leadership. He's born in Surrey. He comes to Canada in 1906. He works as the head of a City of Vancouver department, and he's involved in the militia. He's a major in Leckie's 72nd Regiment, has an MSc, fought in the Boer War. He is well positioned to go far and rise up through the ranks. However, he's appointed a major in the 16th Battalion. He suffers a serious throat wound there, and to the point where he can only speak a whisper. He recovers and commands, or is the commandant for the Corps headquarters camp, and then moves over to England to take over the Provo Corps and back to Canada to do the same. All wishes to say is this is an officer with all the right credentials, and because of the wound that he suffered, his career is derailed. So let me look at the 2nd campaign, and here are soldiers returning from Courcelette, festooned with German regalia from their victory. Now the Corps, or the CEF, has expanded dramatically. There is now a Corps commanded by a British officer, 4 infantry divisions, 18 brigades, and 73 battalions. So I'm saying something like the CRA is the equivalent of a brigade commander because it's a brigadier general. So there's a massive expansion. I'm sure someone's going to say, well, that's why there was so much promotion in the 1st Contingent. And we will talk about that. I keep promising we'll talk about it, but we won't. So how do the 1st Contingent look in 1916? Well, now there's 64% of the officers are at the front, but all of the senior command positions by members of the CF, the major generals, the brigadier generals, the lieutenant colonels, are overwhelmingly dominated by that 1st Contingent, something that's going to last until 1918. So, first officer I want to highlight here is kind of a unique case. This is the only instance I know of where an officer commands 2 unaffiliated battalions with a 2-year gap between them. So this is Stanley Douglas Gardner. He's sitting on a stool, and he's one of 2 officers in July 1916 in the 7th Battalion that were with the unit when it arrived in France in February 1915. So you can see there's been a considerable turnover. He's an Englishman. He arrives in Vancouver in 1910. He's an accountant. He has just 1 year's experience in the 6th Regiment. Not much in the way of credentials. He joins the 1st Contingent as a captain and does extremely well. He's an adjutant and then company commander and takes over the 7th Battalion in August 1916. He leads it through most of the Somme, but suffers from respiratory ailments such that he has to be evacuated. He then holds a training brigade command in England, and he does so for about 2 years, until September 1918, when Currie replaces the commander of the 38th Battalion. He's moved to a staff position. Cam Edwards, the commander of the 38th from Ottawa, is burned out, so he parachutes in Gardner, which is really unusual. An unaffiliated battalion getting a commander who's been off the front for 2 years. Currie did not like to bring in people that have been away from the front for more than 6 months to a year. So this illustrates two things. One, Gardner was a damn good officer, but secondly, that just how desperate was the command cadre situation and supply of officers in 1918. He unfortunately only lasts a month and dies of wounds suffered during the Canal du Nord operation. The second one is the tainted legacy of Garnet Hughes, the son of Sam Hughes. Now, Garnet has got really good credentials. He graduates, he's the top graduate at RMC, he has an MSc, he serves in Currie's 50th Regiment. In fact, he encouraged Currie to join the regiment and command it. And further, he persuaded his father, or at least helped to do so, to appoint him, Currie, to command the 2nd Brigade. He's got 12 years' experience. So he's really, really well positioned. He's appointed the brigade major of the 3rd Brigade as a lieutenant colonel. He unfortunately is an abject failure. He gives wrong coordinates. He sends panicky messages. He is not a good brigade major. Despite that, he's appointed to command the 1st Brigade in November 1915, thanks to his dad. He commands it through Mount Sorel and the Somme, and while he is not the best brigade commander in the Canadian Corps, he's far from being the worst. Nevertheless, when his father is unseated in November 1916, Currie pushes him out, ostensibly because he's exhausted. So what are we going to do with Hughes? Well, I'm going to appoint him to command of the 5th Division. It never got to the front, but it gives him a major general position. But there's a problem there, because Leckie has seniority over Hughes. So the only way you solve this problem is move Leckie to Victoria, make him a major general so he's happy, and then Hughes can take over and everyone is satisfied. So hence the machinations that tend to go on beyond this. So he continues to command the division until it's disbanded in 1918 in February, and he now wants to return to the Canadian Corps. He wants the Canadians to kick Lipset out of the command of the 3rd Division. Lipset is a British officer. Currie refuses to do that. He doesn't want Hughes back under any circumstances. Hughes is offered a training command with the rank of Major General. He turns it down, and he resigns his commission and ends up serving as a civilian in the War Office. So hence the tainted legacy of Garnet. So this is Currie sitting with his Corps staff prior to Passchendaele. So the Corps has grown, or the CF has grown. It's now 103 formations and units, 1 more brigade and a handful more battalions and equivalents. So what's the role of the 1st Contingent here? Well, the Corps commander, all 4 division commanders, 15 of 19 brigade-level commanders are all members of the 1st Contingent. They continue their stranglehold on that position. So war destroys, we all know that, but sometimes it redeems, and this is the case, one of those rare instances. This is William Forbes Gilson. He's born Gilchrist, William Forbes Gilchrist, in India to a British military family in 1877. He's raised in England, attends Sandhurst, joins the British Army, and is cashiered in 1912. All I can say is he overstayed his leave, is what I could find. He washes up on Vancouver shores in 1912 and is working as a laborer in 1914. He joins the 1st Contingent, and it's clear he's got some military background, so he's made a company sergeant major in the 7th Battalion. Well, in the bloodletting that followed after Second Eat, he's commissioned. Suffers an injury in April 1915, a horse accident, like so many officers suffered. He returns in 1916 and follows the same course at Gardner. He's an adjutant company commander, and he replaces Gardner as the commander of the 7th Battalion. And he leads it through the rest of the war, through Vimy, through Hill 70, Passchendaele, and the 100 Days campaign. He wins, or he earns 2 mentions and DSO in bar. So his record is so exemplary, the British expunge his record as being cashiered and replace it that he resigned his commission. Hence, his honor has been redeemed. So this is another interesting case, and it kind of talks to the problems with information and documentation that you get. So his name is John Prowler. He's born in Halifax. So when you fill out the attestation form, he's born in Halifax. He's born to a British military family, returns shortly after he is born with his family, is raised in England, attends Sandhurst, and is a captain in the British Army. He resigns his commission in 1911 and moves to the interior and is a gentleman in 1914. He joins the militia as a captain in the 31st British Horse, has an MSc, has 3 years' experience. And in the first contingent, he ends up as a captain in the Winnipeg 8th Battalion. So how somebody who's a cavalry officer in the interior of BC ends up as an infantry officer in Winnipeg is an interesting challenge. So he leads the 8th Battalion with some success through Vimy, and through Passchendaele, although there are some of his decisions at Passchendaele that look like he's starting to fray at the edges. Currie has a tendency that when he sees officers starting to fail, he moves them into a less volatile position so that they can recover and then return later. So he ends up commanding the Corps Infantry School. So he's still at the front, but not actually in the line of fire. It doesn't hurt his career, however, because he decides to remain in the military, joins the Indian Army, attends Camberley, the Staff College, and retires as a brigadier general. So is he a Canadian? Well, by attestation papers, he's born in Canada, yes, he's Canadian. But he spent almost all of his life living outside of Canada. I code him as being British. So, final campaign, 100 days. And this is a really interesting picture, at least for me, because this is one of the few ones that you see of a headquarters in action. This is the 11th Brigade headquarters on the 2nd of September, 1918. And rather than being in a dugout surrounded by telephone switchboards, they're having to do everything on the fly. Brigade headquarters would move as many as 3 times in a day in advance. So it's a far more mobile, far different kind of experience. So the CEF now consists of 119. So there's still some growth going on, but it's not the breakneck speed that you saw in 1916. So, 100 days, 51% of the officers are still at the front. And again, 80% of the colonels and generals that are commanding combat units are in command. 40% of the battalions are members of the first contingent. So whatever excellence there was in the CEF, it has to be ascribed, and at least in part, to the contribution of the first contingent officers. So last 2 cases I want to look at. This is a Currie protege. This is Robert Percy Clark. He's an Englishman, comes to Victoria in 1903, serves with Currie in the 5th Garrison Artillery as an adjutant, so Currie knows him very well. He's got good credentials. He's appointed as staff captain in Currie's 2nd Brigade. He then holds a number of staff positions, leading the 14th Battalion on the Somme, 2nd Battalion at Vimy, again goes back to a staff role, and eventually takes over the 2nd Brigade in October 1918. Here's an example of Currie keeps his eye out for promising officers and nurtures their career. So he was very familiar with Clark and was helping him along, making sure he got the plum assignments. And here's someone where there's no machinations and there's no Currie. It's just a guy who's a sort of an interesting individual. So this is Norman Roy Roberts. I'm sorry, I don't have a better picture. That's the best one that I could find. He's a Ontario boy, born in Walkerton. At the start of the war, he's a lawyer in Vancouver. But what's interesting about him is that he's serving in the engineers, in the militia. He joins the 1st Contingent as a lieutenant in the 2nd Field Company. He stands up the 9th Field Company in the 3rd Division in February 1916 and commands the battalion that's formed from that company. What's interesting about him is in that larger study, I have 27 engineering officers. Only 2 of them are not certified engineers. The engineers were very much a closed shop. So how a lawyer was able to break those ranks is a really interesting example. Yeah, surprisingly, there was a large number, sorry, I don't recall off the top of my, there's a large number of civilian engineers, like civilians prior to the war, that were engineering officers that actually rose to command battalions because they had the necessary technical knowledge. Artillery was a little bit less restrictive, and the infantry would have taken anybody. Cavalry, artillery, engineers, machine gunners, pioneer officers, anybody. All right, let's get to the conclusion. So this is the Canadians arriving in France in 1915. So why were the first contingent officers successful? Well, there's a really easy answer. 4 times as many units and formations in 1916 as in 1950. And especially when you take a look at who's going to command these units and formations. Well, there's just simply not enough permanent force officers with the appropriate level of training and experience to command. They are busy working in the administrative and staff positions for the most part, and Hughes will not appoint them. So that's not an option. Well, what about militia officers? There's over 100 infantry regiments in the Canadian militia in 1914, almost 30 cavalry regiments. Surely there's people there that you could use, but when you see the success rate, 72 versus 13%, there were very good officers that came later that were not part of that first contingent, but as a percentage, there were far fewer. Hughes did a very good job of picking the best troop or the best leaders he could find. What about the British? Well, they've got a large army, right? Well, at this point, they are beyond scraping the bottom of the barrel. They're appointing officers who've seen a picture of a barrel. So anyone you get from the British is likely, at best, no better than the first contingent and likely far worse. So there really isn't much else to go. Hence, that's why they were so successful. But the issue is the Canadians are damn good in 17 and 18. So somebody must have done something right to fix all of that. And so I think there's a better answer. So part of that better answer is here you see the end of the war, the Canadians crossing the Rhine. So first of all, Alderson, the initial commander of the 1st Canadian contingent, a British officer, cleaned out a lot of Hughes's specials. There were 6 infantry battalions that arrived with 2 lieutenant colonels in command. And so he got rid of those. He got rid of a lot of deadwood. And there's still deadwood around, but he got a lot of them. It's important to ensure that we acknowledge the contribution of the BEF and the British staff to the success. So the Canadians, by part of the BEF, were able to plug into the system. You could bring in artillery brigades. Like 40% of the field artillery that served with the Canadians at Arras were British. Almost all of the heavy artillery, all the tanks were British. But they were able to work seamlessly, more or less, with the Canadians. And the Canadians took advantage of the administrative, logistical, disciplinary infrastructure that the British provided. Canadians could have done it, but that would have been an enormous effort to do that. But the most important element is the training system that the British had. So there's doctrinal documents, there's training for individual soldiers. How do you fuse a 9.2-inch howitzer shell properly? All the way up to how do you lead a battalion in battle? Canadians could take advantage of all of these training courses, which would have been very difficult to replicate if the Canadians were on their own. And then there's the role of the British staff officers. 3 of the future chiefs of the Imperial General Staff served in the Canadian Corps. And there's one more that just barely missed making the cut. These staff officers, for the most part, were superb and were of great benefit. But by 1918, it's only the most senior officers. There's one senior staff officer in a division and at the Corps that are still British. Everyone else has been replaced by Canadians. So while the British had an important role, we can't say, well, it's got to be the British, because how do you explain something like the 31st Division? There are British divisions that are the equal of any Canadian division, but there's sure a lot of them that are far removed from that. So they had access to the same infrastructure, same training, same staff officers, but they somehow weren't able to convert it. In the case of the 31st Division, it's led by professional Army officers. The staff are all professional staff officers, whereas the Canadians are having to deal with militia officers. So there's something else about that. I think a really important point is the backgrounds of these officers. They are successful business and professionals. They are confident. They have overcome challenges. They know what it takes to be a success. Some of them have backgrounds that are directly relevant. FOW Loomis, who commands the 3rd Division at the end of the war, runs the 2nd largest construction company in Canada. What's that all about? It's moving men and materials to a location, build something, rather than destroying it, but it's the same kind of a notion. And often you're dealing with undertrained personnel. I think also we underestimate the value of the militia, in that you're learning, if you have 15, 20 years experience, you're learning about how to handle administration, discipline, training half-trained men. Well, what's the Western Front? You're always dealing with untrained personnel. So that's all experience. The tactics they learned were particularly useful, but then the tactics they would have learned even if they were professionals weren't that useful on the Western Front. Another dimension is time. Canadians were not ready in 1915, but by 1916, 2 Canadian divisions were regarded in the top tier from the Germans. And you have documents to prove that. So there was 18 months between Ypres and the Somme. Canadians learned a lot. They learned how to work effectively on the Western Front and how to deal with the issues. The other part is the nature of the war. So this is a carefully planned where you're setting the pace. You have enough time to plan, gather intelligence, rehearse, prepare, work out all the details, and attack. When the Canadians did not have that, when you have more mobile warfare conditions, they weren't as successful. Take a look at the defensive actions at 2nd Ypres, Saint-Éloi Craters, or Mount Sorel. Canadian command and control breaks down. It breaks down quite badly in these battles. The troops at the battalion level fight superbly, but at the upper echelons, there's a lot of confusion. When you look at the 100 Days campaign, when the Canadians had time to plan a set-piece attack, brilliant. Like the Canal du Nord operation, it's just an outstanding bit of planning. But Currie loses the plot later on in that battle where the troops are being thrown without proper support because there's just not enough time to get everything prepared. So the nature of the war really favors the Canadians and their particular restrictions. And the final point, I think one of the most important of all is, according to this Greek philosopher, you cannot learn what you think you already know. Well, if I got 25 years experience as a battalion commander, you're not going to tell me what to do. Most British officers quickly realized what they had learned before they have to revise. But I'll use the example of Douglas Haig, who in his final dispatch said, "The war was won on the basis of what I wrote in the Field Service Regulations in 1909. You can read that document now, and I see no correlation to how that was of any use. In fact, the first commander of the Australian Imperial Force said, "The Field Service Regulations are about as useful to my officers as cuneiform on brick." So Canadians had the advantage. They didn't know, but they knew they didn't know, so they had to set up a learning organization. And you can see after every battle, they're searching for answers. Now you go to the British and you say, well, don't they do the same? Yes, but they're divisions that keep making the same boneheaded mistakes over and over. Read Jonathan Boff's book on the Third Army in 100 Days. And there are some British units that are learning, constantly evolving and changing to the different conditions. And there are other divisions that just make the same bonehead decision after bonehead decision. I think it's one of the big differences the Canadians knew that they didn't know and they had to learn. So just to conclude, this presentation was brought to you by my latest book, The Hardest Battle. So this is the battle that Currie called the hardest the Corps fought. He thought it a greater victory than Amiens, and as I argue in the book, it is the most important operational assignment the Canadians received in the First World War. So it's based on deep dives into the archives of Canadian, British, and German archives to tell what happened, how it happened, and why it happened. And it's also accompanied by a 24-page map booklet, so you can actually follow what's going on. There's nothing worse for me than having to flip back and forth between pages when you're trying to track what's going on. So if you're interested, come and see me after the question and answer session, and we'll be happy to talk about it. Thank you. So before I answer any questions, I'd ask you to, if you could stand up and speak loudly. My hearing is really poor, so.
Yeah.
You can sit. Yeah, you can sit.
So thanks very much, Bill. It's just those who haven't heard Bill's talks before or read his previous books, one of the things that's really excellent is that deep dive into German records to give a sense of what they thought of what was happening with the Canadians. And that's unique and it's exceptional. It makes his books really valuable to read. The question I had was, well, you just answered in the sense, the cliche that senior officers are fighting the last war as opposed to the current one. You answered that. But now, with training of officers in Britain as the war is going on, where did they enter the command structure? At what level? And what was the record of people moving up through the ranks to senior positions? How good were the Canadians at taking command at a level above when there was field deaths and injuries?
So there was, somewhat belatedly, the British set up what was called the Senior Officers Course. And it was variously in France and then in England. And the idea was to train second-in-commands and battalion or prospective battalion commanders on what they should expect and how to develop it. Canadians actually had a preamble to this in late 1916. Byng set up a course at Corps headquarters where he would regularly lecture. His chief staff officer would come and lecture, and it was set up as kind of a dialogue for battalion commanders to learn from each other. And so there was a lot of this sort of development going on as to how things developed. One of the interesting patterns that you see is that as the war progresses, the quantity of potential battalion commanders that have these impeccable credentials dries up. And so you move from people that, there's a discussion about the Battle of Jutland where the author talks about regulators and rat catchers. So regulators are the officers that stay around in peacetime, that follow the rules. They know their job, but they're polished in our days we'd say PowerPoint ragers. But then during wartime you get rat catchers, rough and ready guys around the edge that you would never select to be a battalion commander. Like there's an example would be Jack Worrell. I forget which battalion. One of the battalions in the 1st Division. So he served in the British Army. He deserted from the American Army. He's covered in tattoos. He comes to Montreal when the war is declared. He joins the battalion. He's appointed a company sergeant major as he proves to the regimental sergeant major that he could drill a squad properly. And he rises through the ranks. So he commands a battalion in 100 days. And when you read his after-action reports, you go, wow, this guy really knows what he's talking about. Like he's just a brilliant operator. So there's a lot of these officers that you would not normally ever expect to reach a command position that do so. You get some really odd characters, like you get C.E. Bent. He's a customs officer. He's a really small little guy. He's got little round glasses, and he looks like the kind of guy that would get picked on in school. Well, he ends up being a brigadier general by the end of the war because he's just really good at what he does. He finds some special skills that are available. So there's a ton of these really interesting stories, especially as the war progresses, as the Corps is talent spotting. And one of the big advantages that the Canadians had as being a semi-permanent Corps is that at the highest level, at Currie and Byng, they're talent spotting all the time. They're seeing which company commanders do they think have the potential to become a good battalion commander, or a battalion commander that could be a good brigade commander. Well, if you get a division that comes into your Corps for 3 days, you have no chance to evaluate any of that. So having the Currie always there, and that also really is important for Canadians follow the doctrine. Now, it wasn't hard and fast, but you had to keep pretty close to it because Currie is going to come to your training sessions. And, if I'm a division commander and I've got some very sharp views on how things should be done, and I'm in a British Corps, I know that next week I'm going to be another Corps. So they're going to have a whole other set of things they want done. So I'm just going to do what I want to do. Can't do that with the Canadians because Currie's going to catch you. or Radcliffe's going to catch you. So you got to follow the rules as you go along. Does that help answer?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Chandra Sundram. I'm a historian primarily of the Indian Army in the first 19th, 20th centuries. But I'm interested in, and I've worked a lot on the Indian Army self-support, but I'm interested in the opinions that the British officers had of the Canadian officers, and did that change over time?
Yes. Okay. Well, I let me expand that. I found a number of quotes where British inspector generals would say comments around the idea that the Canadians, when it comes to training, are really good at things like trench raids and sniping, but when it comes to discipline like square bashing, they're not as good as the British. And likewise, the British Corps commander talks about the Guards Division. It's this crack elite force. They're really good at regimented things, but they're not good at raiding. Like the Canadians are good when things get messy and chaotic. So when it comes to officers, there was the British High Command actually bent way over backwards to accommodate the Canadians. Like the formation of the first contingent, Canadians had never served at a division or brigade level. The largest they ever sent overseas was a battalion, and the British handled everything once they got on the boat. So for the British to say, yes, you can be in charge of this division. We'll have a British officer in charge, but all three brigades are commanded by militia officers. They're very careful, at least the higher levels, to make sure the Canadian noses don't get out of joint. And we do get out of joint quite a bit. At other levels, there is a certain amount of condescension. Curry writes about British officers saying, yeah, well, okay, you're good for the trench-to-trench attacks, but when it comes to open warfare, you guys are just going to flame out. And Curry says, well, you know what? My guys have had 3 years war experience. They have vastly more experience than a lot of your regular Army officers. We'll be able to handle it. There was a certain amount of, how do I say this, jealousy directed towards the Canadians, because Canadians got more of everything. This is a simple thing, but I think it's a nice proxy. So in 1918, during Second Arras, I looked at war diaries, written, whether they're written in pencil or by typewriter. So the Canadians were almost all typewriter down to the battalion level. British divisions, maybe the brigade war diaries written with a typewriter. And typewriters in those days were like a cutting edge of information technology, so that the Canadians had more of everything. So there was a certain amount of jealousy. Now, I'll turn this around. Certainly at Arras, the Canadians by this point have a little respect for a lot of the British. Some of the comments they talk about, yeah, the British battalion wandered into our zone. They didn't know what they were doing as usual. Now, in this case, during Arras, they were stuck beside a territorial corps with some not very good divisions. The Canadians are very confident by 1918 and think that they can take on any number of Brits, and I'm sure that, or Germans, and I'm sure that puts some British noses out of joint. The staff officers that served in the Corps, if they ever got uppity, they were gone almost instantly. So the ones that we got for the most part were understood their role. They're serving with a native unit, so to speak, and they dare not offend the natives, so to speak.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Thanks.
You mentioned MacNaughton. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about his path through the First World War and how it might have influenced his subsequent career in the Second World War.
Sure. Okay, so MacNaughton is a battery commander in the militia in 1914. He commands a battery at Second Ypres, and then he ends up commanding one of the field artillery. And one of the things about the artillery in the First World War, it's constantly being reorganized. You went from 4-gun batteries to 6-gun batteries. At one point, divisions had 4 field artillery brigades. By the end of the war, they have 2. So there's all this reorganization. So he gets kind of bounced around. Where he really makes his edge is, at the beginning of 1917, he's appointed as the counter-battery staff officer. So he's an assistant to the head of the heavy artillery. And it's his job to set up a organization to track the German artillery and defeat it. And by Vimy, they do an extraordinarily good job. Like 83% of the batteries that they had identified have been suppressed. And when you look at 1916, and the song, it's based on my book, they devote 15 minutes to counter battery fire. So they're not treating it seriously, and as a result, they suffered some severe defeats because of German artillery. So by Vimy, they realized we need to develop it, and the Canadians are at the cutting edge. They have the reputation of being far more open, that sometimes you have civilian scientists that come and say, hey, you know what, we can do flash spotting, or we can get identified by sound. And they are greeted with open arms in the Canadian Corps. Come on down, let's take a look at it. And because of McNaughton's engineering background, he gets involved in a lot of this stuff. So the Canadian counter-battery effort is superlative. And it continues to develop through the war. So by the end, he's in command of the heavy artillery of the Canadian Corps, and they run the operation at Valenciennes, and a Canadian infantry brigade that's outnumbered thrashes a German division, inflicts 8 times as many casualties as it loses because of the complexity of the artillery barrage that McNaughton put together. German company commanders said, I didn't know where you were going to be attacking from. I had barrages this way, barrages that way, I didn't know. I just had to throw my hands up. So he decides to stay in the permanent force. And there's a number of officers that were in the militia or were civilians that remain in the permanent force. He ends up being the head of the military during the Depression. Not a really good spot to be in. And so he gets appointed to command the 1st Canadian Division because he's the most experienced and celebrated officer in the Canadian military at that point. And he eventually commands the Canadian Corps and the 1st Canadian Army. But by that point, most of the officers that served in the First World War that lasted to the Second World War are not successes. And he was one of them. It was, his level of responsibility was greater than what he could handle. And he had a reputation for liking to tinker. Like he liked to get under there's a broken down vehicle, he liked to go down and spend time with that, as opposed to dealing as an army commander. You're dealing with all of those other issues of logistics and transportation and fire support, etc.
Thank you.
I've got a question on Curry. He had a good sense of men and assessing them and promoting them to the challenge.
Yeah.
Expand on that?
Well, he was a talent spotter, and he watched out for people that would fit in with him. They tended to serve with him. Curry is what we used to call in high tech a high maintenance kind of guy, and that he gets good results, but in part because he gets more of everything. There's a really interesting comment that McNaughton made. So McNaughton was serving at the Corps headquarters, and when he found out Curry was going to take over the Corps, he was appalled, because Curry was a pain in the ass. He's always demanding more guns, more ammunition, more of everything. But once he got there, he realized, oh, now he can demand more from the British. That's great. So, if you worked for Curry, that's a great experience. But if you were a peer, it was a really frustrating kind of experience. But so if you were directly under him or near him, he would be able to identify qualified officers. Not all were successful. There's the infamous case of the 7th Brigade commander was replaced just before Canal du Nord. He was tired. He was sent to England. So another officer from the 72nd Regiment, Curry's old regiment, 72nd Battalion, was dropped in, and he was not a success. He hadn't had time to learn his trade, and so he was under a lot of pressure to make attacks. His battalion commanders are saying, there's uncut wire in front of us, and he's saying, I don't see any of it in the aerial photos. Well, because the aerial photos, the grass had grown and covered it up. And so they went in and were slaughtered. In fact, one battalion commander was interviewed by the CBC. He says, he's still alive. If I ever see him, I'll kill that son of a bitch. So now that was a case of, could he have improved as he went along? Because he did not have enough time to learn the trade and get comfortable. He was younger than his battalion commanders. And some of these are grizzled veterans. They've been in command for a year and a half. They're not used to having some snot-nosed guy from the 4th Brigade come in and 4th Division come in to tell them what to do. So, it's one of those situations where time and place were just wrong. All right. I'll hand it off to our illustrious leader. Thank you.